Hello, everybody. I'm with somebody I love and admire very deeply. He's an absolutely extraordinary man. His name is Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma. Is that the right translation? It's so difficult to translation. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yes, indeed. Pruiksma. You did it perfectly.
Pruiksma. Pruiksma. And I love your bio, so I'm just going to read it. I think this is a very cheeky bio. Thomas Hitoshi Pruiksma is an author, a poet, a performer. You're a magician, aren't you?
I am also a magician, among other
You're a
things.
magician in many ways, and a teacher. His books include The Safety of Edges, which is a wonderful book of poems that he gave me when he visited me with his husband, David, and Give, Eat, and Live, poems of Avaya. Avaya was who? Was he one of those Tamil Vaishnavite saints?
Well, Abhayar is very interesting because she was a 12th
Oh,
century
she.
woman, poet and
Ah,
saint, through whom I first reconnected not only with poetry, but with the presence of language as a presence. And so I'll have a lot to say about
oh my
her
God,
as
how
well in our
wonderful.
conversation.
Yes, I would love to find that book and I can't wait to read it. He teaches writing for Cozy Grammar and has received grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, For Culture, Artist Trust, the Community of Writers, the US Fulbright Program, the American Literary Translators Association, and Oberlin Shansi. For once, they've been given the money to the right person. I would love to just share something before I begin to interview and talk with my friend. Take a deep look at this extraordinary book, my friends, the Kural, Tiruvalluvar's Tirukural, a new translation of the classical Tamil masterpiece on ethics, power, and love. This book has been a passion of mine for 40 years, and I've read many, many translations of it, but nothing to compare what you, Thomas, have done. It is an absolute grand slam masterpiece. And if we were living in a true sacred culture, there would be hordes of people singing and chanting in the streets your name for the great gift that you've given us at this time of a translation of a mystical masterpiece that has been at the center, as you and I both know, of South Indian mystical and practical life for over a millennium. And your book is coming out at this crucial, terrifying, apocalyptic moment in which we find ourselves. And that isn't a coincidence, because when a great holy masterpiece is recreated and rebirthed through a great translation, it lives again and it lives afresh, and it lives for us now in this time. So anyone who is listening, I beg you, I beg you, I beg you, I beg you to get this book, The Kural, translated by Thomas Pruiksma through Beacon Press, Boston. And I have to say that Beacon Press has done the most astonishing work. It's really produced this book in exactly the way that it needed to be produced, with great elegance and delicacy and strength. So when you buy this book, you're buying the mystical masterpiece of a civilization. You're buying a book that speaks directly to us now and gives us some amazing hints and signs and challenges and exhortations and exaltations. And you're buying a great masterpiece of translation. So how can you not rush out and order the Kural, translated by Thomas Pruiksma, immediately? You won't regret it. Give it to everyone you know. Stand at street corners and hand it out to surprised beings. I just wanted to read to you, to begin our conversations, some paragraphs from the translation that I was privileged to write for this amazing work. 3 years ago, I was in Australia attending the Dalai Lama's teaching on the Tantra of Transfiguration in the Tibetan Vajrayana tradition. For days, His Holiness poured out precise transcendent wisdom in a stark cement room draped with Tibetan tankas. In a corridor after the last session, I had the opportunity to ask him a question. Do you think humanity will survive? He paused and said quietly, I do not know, no one knows. And then he smiled. Prepare for the worst, but work tirelessly for the best. Prepare for the worst, but work tirelessly for the best. Those who work tirelessly for the best, and I know that, Thomas, you are one of those, the birth of a new kind of human being and a new world rising like a phoenix out of the smoldering ashes of the old, know one thing. They know that our greatest hope, encouragement, and inspiration will come not from our contemporary, absurdly narcissistic New Age spirituality, nor from the religions in their state of decay, nor from science, or from economics, or political change, but from the treasure houses of mystical wisdom that mature ancient civilizations offer us. The enlightened testimony of the great sages offers us the peace and rigor of timeless truth as the foundation of the one life worth living at any time, but especially in this one. And that is a life surrendered to the divine, loving and serving its laws of compassion to and justice for all, whatever the hell or heaven happens. This is where the majestic masterpiece of South Indian civilization, the Kural, written in the 11th century probably, comes in. Its author, Tiruvalluvar, is not only one of India's but one of the world's greatest poets, a master of the couplet aphorism, the most naked and exigent of forms. He is a sage of sacred life, and his vision of a world flooded with divine presence and governed by divine laws, whose observance engenders joy, balance, and harmony for all beings, could not be more relevant or inspiring for us, or more essential, not only to admire, but to learn from. The Kural offers us nothing less than a balanced and precise vision of how to live, work, and flourish in an already sacred world, a world known and recognized to be entirely sacred in all of its realms, both transcendent and immanent. It invites us calmly and with both ruthless and exalted authority to celebrate this sacred reality and respect its laws in every activity and domain in our lives, or risk our destruction and the destruction of the creation it is our responsibility to protect. The Kural could only have been written by an enlightened being, and in the astoundingly fresh and vibrant translations that adorn this book, the work of this great sage can now reach the universal audience that so deeply needs its universal wisdom. So that was my attempt to celebrate this book that has played such an important, deep, secret role in my own life, in much less exciting translations than the one that you've been given to us. So, my friend, how did Thomas come to the Kural? How did this book come into your life in South India?
Thank you, Andrew. This is really, it's a great pleasure to be speaking with you and to hear you read those wonderful paragraphs from your foreword. I came to the Kural through a number of different interrelated doorways. The first time I heard of it, I had heard of it in general. When I was preparing to go, after graduating from college, I received a fellowship to live for 2 years in the ancient and sacred city of Madurai, which has been a heart of Tamil culture and language for millennia. And I was teaching English at a college, but more important, I was learning the Tamil language and hoping to live in a village where I wanted to taste something of what life in a rooted, integrated community, what that feels like. And 2 or 3 months into my stay, fairly early on, one of my students invited me home for dinner. and I was
Tamil
astonished.
hospitality, Tamil
Oh my
love.
goodness.
Oh my God, yes.
I was astonished by this feast, and all of his friends and neighbors came to see this American teacher who somehow could speak a word or two of Tamar. And at the end of this visit, my student's father presented me with two books. One was a book of contemporary poetry, and the second was the Kural, the Tirukural. And it was in one of these gift editions where there's on one side there's the verses, and on the other side there are some very simple contemporary Tamar renderings of these verses. And he gave this book to me and he said, this book has everything you need. It treats every part of life that you need to know about. So when you learn Tamar, and you must learn Tamar well, you must also read this book. And I took that book, those two books, with me into the night as I returned to my quarters at the college where I was then living. But at the time, I had no idea that I would ever be able to read this book, let alone dare to translate it. Because at the time, I was really focused on learning how to speak Tamar, which is
difficult enough.
Which is difficult enough. And Tamar is a language which the linguists call a diglossic language, meaning it has very distinct spoken forms and a written form. And I thought, I have my hands full enough trying to learn how to speak this impossible seeming language. But I was given an extraordinary gift of a great, great teacher named Dr. K.V. Ramakodi. And he guided me step by step into being able to speak the language. And then at a crucial juncture, he said, oh, and we're also going to learn to read and write. And I was still sort of bewildered enough by the language to think, oh, golly, how could I possibly do that as well? But he insisted. And we started to learn to read and write. In fact, I went through the entire series of readers put out by the Tamar government, the government of Tamar Nadu, from sort of the equivalent of sort of kindergarten all the way up through the equivalent of 12th grade. And in this process, he also introduced me to poetry, which was something that as a student I had sort of lost contact with, probably because in so many places poetry was taught as a kind of intellectual puzzle, something you had to figure out, and that was very obscure and full of things like metaphors and similes, and who really cares anyway? I mean, that's the sort of unspoken lesson that some of my schooling gave me. And but my teacher, and by this point I had come to trust my teacher, said, we're going to start poetry with a 12th century Tamar woman poet and saint named Abbayar. And he started me on a series of her very short 4-line poems, these little quatrains that were about what it means to live a good life. And he insisted that I memorize them. And because enough time had passed between the 12th century and at the time the 20th century, that I couldn't yet understand the poems directly, I could only do one thing, which was to listen to the sounds that the poems made, and more than that, to listen to how they felt in my body, to be embodying the poems, to be speaking them out, giving them my own breath, feeling them on my own tongue, and playing against my own teeth, my own lips. And this was the great doorway, because listening to the poems in a way that I hadn't listened since the time that perhaps I was just a young baby, listening to these poems, I could hear, even not understanding them, that they sounded and sound good, that they have music, that they have rhythm, that they have a delight not only in language, but in life, a delight that becomes contagious, that can enkindle a person, that can make a person glow in their presence. And so when I did come to understand the meaning of these verses, that meaning was all the more meaningful because I had first come to savor and delight in their music. And so this was a great opening for me, opening me not only to poetry and Tamar, but even to my own language, to English, to its own poetic riches and depths, and started me on what has now become a two-decade apprenticeship to poetry and to language. And so how does the Kural come into this? It comes into this several years later, in 2003 and 2004, when I returned to Tamar Nadu on a Fulbright grant to study the relationship between language and land, and between people and place, both in the literary written language as well as in the spoken language. So I spent my weeks,
What a
my week.
fascinating subject. My God, and how directly related in secret ways to the Kural.
Indeed. And in fact, this is one of the things that, I mean, to this day continues to surprise me, because I didn't at the time have
Oh,
any
you were
idea
being
that I was
led,
going to
my friend. You were
translate this book.
selected upstairs to do this work, and they said, well, this is the steps. We've got to get him educated in all of these ways.
Indeed. So I
Yeah.
spent my weekdays as a guest in my Tamar teacher's house, and on the weekends I would go to the village where I had ended up living during the second year and a half of my initial stay, and speaking with my friends there, and really hearing as deeply as I could the poetry of their own day-to-day speech. And as
And that
part of
was a
this,
thrilling experience for you, wasn't it? Because when one of the times we first talked to you, we had a long conversation about how revelatory it was for you to live in a village with these amazing, vibrant, embodied, loving people.
it was really quite
Can you just
extraordinary.
tell us a bit about that? Because in a way, that world is the world from which the Kural came. Because as you know, Tamil Nadu in certain ways has changed very much, and in other ways hasn't changed at all. That the world that's described in the Kural is vibrantly and richly alive, isn't it?
Oh my goodness. And in some ways, no place more so than in a village like the one that I was blessed to become a part of and to continue being a part of. It was such an extraordinary experience that to this day I find it difficult to articulate it. But I
Right.
can say, let me say this thing, which is that one of the things that the Kural speaks about so eloquently is what we alluded to earlier, the art of hospitality. And so during the week, I'd be reading what this great poet, sage, had to say about the art of hospitality, and then I would experience that art in vibrant, living, day to day, nitty gritty practice among these very humble and beautiful villagers, for whom, for instance, it was just a practice that you always had enough food for an unknown guest or many guests, whether or not you knew anyone was coming. And it was just this is a daily thing, that there is always enough food, and they've arranged their lives in such a way that no food gets wasted. The extra food is sort of transformed into food for the next morning, for breakfast and for meals the next day, but is there should someone unexpectedly arrive at your door. And I, living there, being there with those with my friends who became in my family, uh, I got to taste what it looks like and what it feels like to watch these ideals embodied and practiced, without any self-consciousness, fully and beautifully and freely.
And that was crucial, wasn't it? Because that gave you the emotional key, the spiritual key, the practical emotional and spiritual key to undertaking the translation. How did that come about? How did you pluck up the courage to take on this great masterpiece that has been the subject of innumerable commentaries, that has also been translated often very badly by all kinds of Victorian clergymen and others? How did you pluck up the courage to plunge into dedicating yourself to do that? That's an amazing thing to do.
Well, it would take me another decade. That year, among the work that I studied with my teacher was the Kural. And we read, in fact, I brought this with me. Um, this is the very
Oh,
edition that I studied. In fact, I'll hold this close so perhaps you can see what
so
the,
everybody could see the craziness of the Tamil script. It
yes, you
looks
can
like
see the beautiful
wild.
Tamar
Oh,
script there. This was an edition that
Devagis.
my that my teacher insisted that we use because it contains all of the old commentaries written somewhere perhaps between the 11th and the 13th centuries. The Kural itself is dated.
Nobody knows much about either him or the time it was written. It's
There
a
are wild
strange
debates
birth.
about it. My teacher came to the conclusion probably around the third century. Many
Really, that
contemporary
early?
thoughters say third or fourth century, fourth or fifth century, and there are people who would date the work even earlier. I think somewhere between the third and fifth centuries is a pretty good educated guess. Um, and so so that year we spent a number of months on the work. The work has 133 chapters, each of which deals with one specific aspect of life, such as rain or hospitality or gratitude or knowing the
Friendship.
right to do something, the
Beautiful.
right
Yeah.
time to do something, or friendship, indeed.
Yeah.
And so we read one chapter a day with these, which had these 10 very short verses. And then we also read all of these old commentaries. So I was being
Marinated.
introduced not just to the language of Tiruvallur, but to the great language of each of these commentators, each of which had their own very distinct style and sometimes vocabulary. And so all of this I was taking in. I was also memorizing all of my favorite verses, some 600 or 700 of these verses. And I even learned to write in the verse form that Tiruvallur uses, which is called the Kural.
Oh,
The name comes from the verse form. Kural is the verse form, and Tirukural, the full name of the book, is the great Kural or the holy Kural, or the sacred Kural. These are all different ways that it can be translated. And so I immerse myself in the work, but with the intention at the time of just being able to enter it, being able to think about it in Tamil, being able to relate it to my lived experience in both the city and in the villages. But interestingly enough, it was never in my thoughts to translate it. I was working on my own capacity to write as a poet, and so I was trying to learn from Tiruvallur what it would mean to be a poet in my own language. However, in the years since, when I would speak with my Tamil teacher on the phone, or when I would be able to go back and visit him in Tamil Nadu, he would say things to me like this: "You know, Tom, somebody really ought to do a proper literary translation of the Tirukkural, using all of those old commentaries that you and I studied." And I would always say something like, "Oh, well, of course, I think that would be a great project for somebody to undertake. I'm sure there's a up and coming PhD candidate somewhere who can
yes,
take
I'm
it
sure
on."
there's somebody over there who would be perfect for it. Yes, yes.
And so it wasn't until 2015, I think, when it suddenly occurred to me, and who knows where these things come from. I suddenly thought, well, maybe I'll give it a try. I'll translate one verse a day as part of my continuing practice as a writer and as a poet. And so on the 1st of January 2016, I began translating the first verse, and each day I did another verse. And in a couple weeks' time, I had 2 or 3 chapters, and I called up my teacher and I said, "Hey, I thought maybe I'll give translating this work a try." And he said, "Oh, good.
Oh, finally, he's got it. He's got it.
Finally, you got the hint," he said, "and I ain't getting any younger here. So you make your translation and you get yourself back here and we'll look at it together." And you know what's so astonishing to me about this, Andrew, is that in every other aspect of life, my teacher never hesitated to tell me what he thought I should do or what he thought I shouldn't do. It was part of our not only relationship as
Part of the
student and teacher,
teacher-disciple relationship in India too, isn't it?
exactly, part of that, and part of our friendship, and part of me being
Yes.
part of his family as well. But I think because he was a poet himself, he knew that you can't tell someone to do something like this. Either it will
Too
occur to
sacred
them
a task.
naturally.
It has to come out of the depths of your own destiny,
Exactly.
doesn't it?
Exactly.
You can't just be told by somebody to translate a great mystical masterpiece. It has to take hold of you. You have to marinate yourself in it. It has to correspond with some deep sacred hunger in yourself, and then it comes together.
Exactly.
This is
My
how it's been for
experience
me.
is
Yes.
very much that I don't get to choose what I translate.
Right.
It chooses
Me too.
me, and I
Yes.
either have the audacity to
Yes.
say yes or not.
Yes.
And
What
so,
gave you that audacity, do you think?
well, I
What
think
gave
it
you
was
that?
that I had felt that I had become, first of all, a better poet in English, that I had actually over what was 15, 16 years come to some sense of facility in English, because I think to translate a work like this, a person has to become
Oh my
a
God,
poet.
yes. Oh, yes.
Because and my aim for the translation from the very beginning was that these verses be in English themselves poems,
Yes.
poems that people can experience as such, with all of the sonic richness that includes the rhythm, the sounds of the words, and the silences between the words. All of those things. I wasn't up to it until I got to the point where I was barely ready, which of course is the time to begin.
Well, I think that's one reason. That's probably the most obvious reason. But don't you think that you had been prepared by so many things, by your relationship with him, by the flowering of love between you and your friends in the Tamil village, by your opening to the glory of Tamil poetry, and by your own deep falling in love with Indian civilization and Indian culture. Don't you think that played an enormous part in it also, that this was really a choice of deep passion, of deep sacred longing and passion?
Very much so. I'm astonished by all the ways that the different pieces sort of worked themselves into place so that they were all there when it was time for me to say yes and embark on this practice and adventure and
Well,
see.
also that you were embarking on this practice and adventure at a very crucial moment in your own life. It was in your late 30s, wasn't it, that you started?
That's true. That's true. I
Yes.
was right toward
Well,
the end
that's a
of.
very crucial stage in the life of a man, of a human being.
Mm-hmm.
It's a stage of maturity. It's a stage when a lot of life still lies ahead, but in which you're going to have to make certain fundamental ethical and spiritual choices for the direction of your life.
Very much
So,
so.
what more extraordinary work to concentrate on than this masterpiece of brilliant sacred direction?
Yes, yes. There's no doubt about it. There is. It was helping to form me as I was coming into this new phase, this new era in my own life.
Well, exactly. And from our talks, I've gathered that in many, many ways you were excited to be in America and you're excited by American life, but you also saw its limitations and the limitations of the Western mind and the Western approach. And India had opened up a vast spiritual depth to you, and you knew that you were going to have to go back to the West and live in the West and work in the West. So your translation of the Kural for me is your attempt to birth an East-West identity, a sacred culture in yourself that would enable you to live as a fully sacred being within the constrictions and limitations and devastations of Western culture. So you were forming your own unique personal spiritual identity through this astonishingly profound relationship with this astonishingly profound book. Does that make any sense
That
to you?
makes enormous sense. And in fact, there's one more way in which I was prepared before I knew I was being prepared, which is that when I was an undergraduate, I studied philosophy and particularly moral philosophy. And I was
Right.
struck even then by a division which is part of our inheritance, for better or for worse, in what we call Western civilization, which divides poetry and philosophy as if they were two different things, as if you wanted to
As
study
if all,
wisdom.
as if all the great mystical philosophy wasn't the deepest and most holy form of poetry. And so many of the
Exactly.
great mystical texts are texts of sublime, the greatest imaginable poetry.
Exactly. And so
Right.
for me, I was healing a split within my education. I was healing a
You're
split
bringing it
within
all
my
together.
experience and trying to see what does this look like in English, where we have a sacred marriage, if you will, of poetry and philosophy, of wisdom and the music of wisdom.
Let's plunge into the Kural and let me ask you first, what is Tamil like to inhabit at the depth that you've been graced to inhabit it? When you described, it's so beautiful, when you were describing these verses that you didn't know the meaning of, but that possessed you, intoxicated you. What is the quality of the language that is so rich and intoxicating? Because I have a smattering of Tamil. I was born in South India, but you're a real scholar of Tamil and you speak it beautifully and fluently. And I've always been told, both by Tamil Indians, of course, but also by great scholars, that Tamil is a monumentally potent and powerful spiritual language, a language which carries enormous sacred power, like Sanskrit. How would you, in your own words, express what engaging with the sonority and passion of Tamil is like? Difficult question, but I think it's so important for people to realize that a book like this comes out of a whole field of embodied, impregnated meaning.
Well, that's a wonderful question. And let me see if I can speak out of not knowing what I'm going to say. I think I'd say two things. This is what occurs to me is that what I find in the experience of the rhythms and the music and the sounds of Tamar is on the one hand an extraordinary majesty, which is
Mm.
akin to the majesty of the sky or the breadth
Mm.
of the earth. There, many times, the old Tamil poets will speak about the wide world, and there's a sense in which their language reaches out to encompass with all of their senses this the sensual, living, embodied experience of the wide world, and at the same time, an extraordinary intimacy and
Mm.
tenderness, the intimacy of the friend, of the beloved.
Mm. Of
And
the
so
mother
it is a
almost
language
too.
which encompasses all of these things with all of our senses, this majesty and this intimacy.
Speak some Tamil for us.
So here's an example of how Tamil might be spoken just day to day in the street. வாங்க ஆண்ட்ரூ, நீங்கள் வந்து உட்காருங்க, நம்ம சாப்பிடுவோம், ஒன்றா சாப்பிடுவோம். When I just said, hello Andrew, come, sit down, it's time for us to eat together.
Yes. It's a deeply embodied language, isn't it? When you talked about saying it out loud and getting intoxicated by it, when I've tried to speak it, I've felt the whole of the language resonate from between my throat and my belly. Other languages live up here. Some languages live up here. French is here. But Tamil's very, very sensual and
Yes.
grounded and luscious in the way in it unfolds, isn't it?
Indeed. In fact, my very first week studying with my teacher, we entered into the sounds in a way I thought I already knew what these sounds were about. And he said, "Oh no, you have no idea with how to open up." So, for instance, just the sound of ah, I would be saying the sound of this first vowel of the language, and he'd say, you don't say it like you do in North America, where you're probably, it's cold, it's a cold country, right? He's saying to me, and so you're going to be sort of holding the heat inside your mouth. He said, no, you have to open your throat.
Gorgeous. I've often thought that Tamil sounds like if mangoes could speak, they would speak Tamil.
Yes.
If the most luscious, most golden, most tasty of fruits could speak, it would speak the glory of this language.
You know what's so beautiful about that image is that the word mango is a gift to us in English from Tamil. It comes originally from Tamil and travels to Malayalam and travels from there to Portuguese and from there into English. And so, yes, it is the most mangoist of languages.
So tell us a bit too about the way in which this great Tamil masterpiece, the Kural, is constructed, and why you believe now, having spent so much inner and outer time with it, it was constructed in that way. It's fundamentally 3 books, isn't it?
Yes.
And books that many Western commentators have not been able to understand why they were put together, but and I know why they were put together in the beautiful way they do, but I'd love it if you just explain to us why these 3 separate books come together in the way they do.
Wonderful. There is a conception, a very deep conception of the 4 aspects of life across of Indian culture and civilization and history, which is the first area would be the area of ethics,
and the relationship to the divine, yes.
And the relationship to the divine, the relationship of the household, the life of the ascetic for someone who chooses that life. So that's one area. The second area is what we could call wealth or power or
prosperity,
politics.
Yes.
Prosperity, and which includes the political life, the life of the state, the life of a community.
And very important in the Kural, because in a sense, the Kural, the real meat of the Kural is that second book, which is directed directly to the vision of an ordered political royal world, isn't it?
Exactly. And one of the things that makes the book, I think, so accessible and deeply practical is that it's interested in this nitty-gritty embodied experience of how we do this. How do we have communities that are just? How do we have leadership?
Integrate the divine into every detail of our lives, including the way in which we deal with each other in business and in politics and in every aspect of how we are?
Yes. And it's
right.
worth noting in this context that the Kural was a book that was deeply inspirational for Mahatma Gandhi,
Yes.
particularly in his as he was coming to his own conception of nonviolence and the power of nonviolence.
Well,
In fact,
also as
he
he was
aspired
coming
to
to his
learn Tamil just so
right.
he could read the Tirukural in its original.
But I think it was even more than that for Gandhi, because Gandhi was attempting not only to bring this holy vision of nonviolence in, but also to give India a vision of its own health and holistic understanding, and a vision of the ancient embodied divine culture that it still had, which it must not forfeit to Western contamination. That was also part of why he spun and stressed ascesis and clarity and deep honesty and purity of motive in all aspects of life. And in the Kural, he found the guide to that, didn't
Yeah,
he?
yeah. He took
Yeah.
extraordinary guidance
Mm.
from particularly, well, the first and the second parts.
And he
And
quoted endlessly from it
oh
too.
my
In
goodness,
his
yes.
speeches,
He once said that there is no other poet sage that has given to the people as much in as few words as Tiruvallur, the poet of the Kural.
wow, wow.
So that's the second and longest section of the book. And then there's this third section, and this is the section that you alluded to earlier that has given commentators trouble because
Especially
it is about
Victorian clergymen.
especially the Victorian clergyman, and anybody of that sort of who has
A
some sort of
puritanical vision. Yes,
puritanical
yes.
separation of the spirit and the body, because it deals with love and it deals with erotic love,
Mm.
um, and it deals with the life of the heart as it plays out in both committed relationships and at the beginning of relationships, when our love for one another, for the lover and his or her beloved, might yet still be secret, maybe even to them, or maybe even to the other person, or seem to be so. And so there are these 25 beautiful chapters on love, and longing, and in some ways they are the most delightful and playful
Oh,
and surreptitiously
luscious and
profound verses.
sexy, deeply sensual and passionate and beautiful. But he was writing at the time when the great Tamil poets had already created a great erotic poetry, wasn't he?
Yes, yes, and he was
Yes.
drawing on the great traditions of Tamil love poetry, going back to what's called the Sangam period, the
Right.
earliest great flourishing of classical Tamil poetry. And so there is a fourth area of life in this traditional four-part scheme, and this fourth area is liberation from the cycle of birth and death.
And that's
Release.
not in the book, is it? But there are reasons for that, don't you
Yes,
think? Yes.
exactly. And the traditional answer, and the one that I think is a true
Oh, yeah.
answer, is that if you live the other three areas of life completely, liberation, moksha, virde in the Tamil term, it comes of a course.
It ripens like a mango.
Exactly.
It ripens from within nature ordered by divine law.
It ripens inevitably and beautifully.
Yes. And that is an extraordinary truth, isn't it? Which is implicit throughout the Kural.
Yes.
That
And it's
fourth unheard book is actually heard in every couplet.
yes.
He doesn't have to lay it out, because what he's describing is the way in which a life that is ordered by divine truth, divine compassion, divine duty will inevitably flower into full liberation, embodied divine liberation. Wow. That's very amazing, isn't it? When you stop and sit back and think about that, because it means that he had such deep trust in life
Yes.
itself, that life was intrinsically holy and divine. And if only we could attune ourselves to its beauty in all of its forms that are all inspired by the divine source, that beauty and that honor and that rigor and that purity would guide us to our fullest flowering, which is inevitably and naturally in liberation.
Yeah.
That's a very different view from some of the other Indian schools of spirituality, which was so life-denying and so matter-hating and so body-hating and so sex-hating. But what we have in the Kural is what we still find in South India, which is a vision of the golden life, engoldening you naturally into engoldenment, living as a free, loving, compassionate, embodied, divine human being, humbly, simply, sweetly, funnily, kindly.
All of it.
All of it. It is still alive in Tamil Nadu, and you know that. You had a teacher who exemplified that. In your village buddies, you tasted the sweetness of the depth of friendship that lives in Tamil Nadu.
Yes.
And in the poetry that still created it there, it's still soaked with all of this, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. I mean, you'll find verses from the Kural posted on the city buses. So as you take your
everywhere.
bus into the city or out of the city or wherever you're going, there will be a verse waiting for you to catch your eye and to transform your morning.
I'd love to just ask you to choose 3 couplets that mean a lot to you at this moment in this conversation, and speak them in Tamil and tell us about what you experienced when you came to dare to translate them, because they're so intricate and sophisticated and crafted, and so wild, that it was a huge effort, wasn't it, to get them into a language that could echo that wildness and embody that wildness in English, which you have spectacularly and amazingly done, which is one of the many reasons why, if I could, I would buy 1 million copies of this and make everybody read it. That's why COVID came, is to give people the chance to actually read the Kural in your translation, because it would be of that deep a help to them. Choose 3 that really speak to you and help us enter a little the gorgeous golden palace of this work.
Sure. I had been thinking about, what verses might I share. Let me share the ones that occur to me in the context of our own conversation here. I mentioned this village that I became a part of and continue to be part of. In that village, I became basically the son in a wonderful family. And I had a village amma and appa, mother and father, and I have brothers and sisters.
And cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents.
Innumerable aunties and uncles and cousins. But the youngest son in this family, this is to give you an example of this extraordinary power of relating. The youngest son in the family declared he would not get married until his older brother, his anna, who could come back to be there for it. And so I had to find some way to come back to be there for this wedding. And what I didn't know, as I was madly trying to find some way to get my tickets and to fund a trip, was that his amma, our amma, had become quite ill. And in fact, she had almost died. She had spent a whole night basically at the brink of death, with everybody, all of her family around her, crying and praying and praying and crying. And somehow she pulled through. And the agreement of the family, that what all the family agreed was the case, and all of the village, in fact, said, oh, well, she's waiting for her other son to come back for the wedding and to see again. And so when I came back and I saw her, she was sitting by the village well, waiting for me, and both of our eyes just filled with tears. And even though I hadn't yet heard the story of her, how close she had been to death, I knew it, and she knew it, and we knew that we were in a very holy, sacred moment of being able, by chance and fortune and all the good graces of the cosmos, to be together one more time. And so here's a verse which speaks and has helped me remember and cherish that memory in even greater depth. It comes from a chapter, fittingly enough, called Having Love. And it's the first of the 10 verses in the chapter. And I'll do it in English, and then I'll do it in Tamil, so you might hear some of the flavor of the Tamil and the English playing together, and then I'll do it in the English again. Thiruvalluvar says, is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. anbirkumundo arikum tar, arvalar pun kanir pusel tarum. Is there a latch for love? The fullness of one's heart shows in the tears that well. And for me, that very short little verse captures both the great joy and the great sorrow of loving in the world, and how when tears come, they are simultaneously a sign of great joy and a great sorrow. The joy that we have met and that we have come to share a love, and the sorrow that this love is constantly changing and that our human experience of it is constantly changing. And so I think of that verse any time that I am moved, any time that I am experiencing that fullness of heart, which inevitably shows itself in our bodies and in our embodied experience.
And it's such a key, it seems to me, to the Tamil character. My father, who was British and had Indian blood from Andhra Pradesh, was the head of police in Tamil Nadu, and he had a particular district, actually, Tiruvannamalai. And I one day asked him, what is the characteristic of the Tamil people? What did you learn about them? And my father adored the Tamil people. And he said, they are the most profoundly emotional people that you will ever meet. And if you don't understand that about them, you understand nothing. They can be very fierce, they're very loyal, they're very passionate, and they're very inwardly tender. And if you know that, they will love you because you respect that vulnerable beauty that they, all men and women, cultivate in the depths of their hearts. And it's been my experience with my Tamil friends that I don't think I've ever felt as loved by anyone as I have felt by my Tamil friends, because they love you completely, open-armedly, open-souledly, no agenda. They're so thrilled that you're just there with them having a tea, that they transform the most ordinary kinds of meals and meetings into divine occasions. They really know through this extraordinary gift of emotional vulnerability the divine life. They do.
Yes.
That's true, isn't it?
It's very true. And in fact, that tenderness, that, my years of being there and being with my friends there and my family there, is that tenderness has been given room to blossom, to come out of its shy hiding place and to dare to be emotional.
Too.
Yes.
In
Oh
both
my gosh.
sexes, the women, of course, but the men, they're very virile men, but they are lovers.
Yeah. 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 They're able to be both at one time.
Exactly. And that's true of the Kural too, isn't it? That's true of
Oh
him.
my goodness. Yes,
He's
it
such
is.
a sacred marriage of the deepest feminine and the most rigorous and exalted masculine. It's extraordinary. But
Yes.
in that, he is embodying the depth of his own culture, isn't he?
Yes. Yes. And it is a book which is as hospitable to a reader as a great Tamil family would be hospitable to a guest.
Yes. What's the second one that you would choose? That was so beautiful.
So that was a verse from the first section on virtue, on ethics. Let me see. Here's one that was important to my Tamil teacher, and it has to do with compassion. And because it comes from the second section of the book, it has to do with the compassion of leaders. In the traditional language, the compassion of the king. But we can understand this as the compassion of any leader, whether the leader of a nation or of a family or an organization. But it also connects with the cosmos, as every single one of these verses do. And it uses a very particular word in Tamil for compassion, which I've translated it as eyes that are moved. How our eyes become moved, how we become moved to see things through a quote unquote other's eyes, and how we come to embody this compassion, which we can see so clearly in our eyes. And it's the first verse of these 10 verses. And this is a very old and profound Tamar idea that's being shared here. Tirvalur says, the astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved because it exists. This world exists. கண்ணோட்டம் என்னும் கழிப்பெறும் கரிகை உண்மையாந்துண்டிவ்வுலகு. The astonishing beauty of eyes that are moved because it exists. This world exists. And so you can see here how this capacity for compassion is what keeps the cosmos in motion. And you can see here also an example of how...
And what makes us divine.
Exactly.
Yes. Because ideally, we're looking at the world with God's own eyes.
Yes, yes. And you can see here how the welling of tears that was spoken of in the realm of the household and of virtue and of ethics then becomes here amplified in the realm of the cosmos and of the kingdom of the community.
So beautiful. But it's so Tamil that it should be connected with the tears of awe and bliss and sweetness. Because we don't cry just because we're heartbroken. Sometimes we cry because it is so beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we're so grateful that what else can we do?
So grateful. Exactly. Oh, I had an amazing teacher in Tamil Nadu too. And I'd love to tell this story to you because I don't think I have told it to you, but it mirrors so exactly what you experienced with your teacher. When I was 27, I went back to India and I was miserable and suicidal, and I found myself in Tanjore, and I wasn't on a spiritual path, but I was intoxicated by Indian art, and I went to the great museum of Tanjore, which has the great Shaivite bronzes, the Chola bronzes. And there I met the head of the museum, a man called Mr. Ratna Sabapati. And Mr. Ratna Sabapati was an old Tamil Brahmin in his 70s, enormously grand and dignified and so sweet and so kind and so soft-spoken. And he must have seen that I was out of my mind. So he took me under his wing and we talked and talked. And then he said, you know, I'm writing a book on the bronzes, and I would love it if you would help me and stay for 3 weeks and let me take you around to each bronze and talk about them and show you what I've written, and you can edit them because you're English and you're Oxford professor, and we can have so much fun. And in between, I and my wife will feed you. So I would go every day, twice a day, to this old 17th century home with a Ganesh in the middle of the courtyard with his beautiful old wife, and sit with the two of them in silence and eat their food, and we'd sing to Ganesh. And I would be impregnated by the spirit that had created the Chola bronzes. And then he would hand me his writing, which was often hilarious. For example, one day he'd written, "The nipples of Parvati in this bronze are obsessed." And I had to try and persuade him, in this grand, beautiful Brahmin gentleman, that you can't really talk about obsessed nipples in a text because it means something else to Western. So we changed the word and we talked about the right word. The point of the story is that years later, I went back after he had died, and the book was published. It's actually the book on Tamil bronzes in the museum, wonderfully produced with this text that I'd edited it. I bought it, of course, and I took it back to the hotel. And then I opened it to the last page, and he had printed a letter that I had written to him on that last page. Yeah. He didn't have to do that. But that's the heart of a great teacher. That's the eyes that are moved. He wanted me to know that he loved me and that I was part of this tremendous book. And I have never forgotten that.
That's so beautiful.
So, but you know that's the kind of person your teacher was, isn't it?
Yes. After my first stay there, which turned out to be 2.5 years, when I didn't know if I would ever return again, he surprised me on one of my last visits to his house and said, "Oh, I I made you something.
Mm.
And he had written by hand a little book of grammar.
Mm.
All the key points culled from the great old Tamil grammatical texts, which are about not just the grammar of language,
the
but the
whole
grammar of
spirituality
language, of life of
right.
itself. And he'd written a grammar book for me, which was more than a grammar book. And I took that with me and learned how to read in the grammar. And that too, for instance, was preparing me for being able to read and then translate the Tirukkural.
Well, what I felt about Mr. Ratna Sabapati was that by the end of those 3 works, I was in some sense his son.
Mm.
In a deep sense, his son. And I'm sure you feel that about your teacher.
Very much so.
There's such profound compassion and tenderness and deep desire to communicate a whole lifetime's adoration to
Yes.
the one that is receptive.
Yes.
But it's done in such a deeply reverential and tender and kind way, isn't it?
Yes.
Amazing people.
My teacher once said to me, I just want to pour everything I know into you.
Right.
I was, and then what could I say? What could I do but try to be open enough to receive at least some of that gift?
Well, you have received it and you have given it back in this unbelievably beautiful book. And just let's end our conversation with the 3rd couplet that you chose.
Okay. I thought I'd read a couplet from the chapter, the part of the book, or the book in the book on love. Here's one from the very last chapter. And the last 3 chapters of the book are on sulking. They are on
a very important part of love. Yes.
Exactly, a committed married couple.
And you must enjoy it in all its varieties.
Oh
yes.
my goodness.
And until you read the Kural, you don't know how many varieties of it there are. It's
oh my
so
goodness. So true.
Mathematics of sulking.
Yeah. I mean, there's. I'll just to give you the briefest of tastes. Chapter 131, sulking. Chapter 132, sulking's subtleties. And chapter 133, the final chapter, sulking and bliss. And with that bliss, we are reminded again of the silent, and in some ways the loudest of the 4 parts, the part that isn't written, but which resounds around and beneath all
also
of the other
connection
parts.
Then that's why the book contains that love chapter, is because in the experience of loving with all of its madness and wildness, we begin our apprenticeship to divine love, and they're inseparable.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And so in these verses on sulking, it's about the experience of being in a committed relationship, and then a harsh word is said, and one of the people turn away, and that's the sulking. They go into the corner and they sulk. And then, but what these chapters celebrate is not just that, but that is the prelude to the return, to a return in which the love deepens and is refined and becomes even more sweet. In another of the verses, Tiruvallur says that sulking is like salt.
Yes.
You put just the right amount in, and all of the flavors come alive. You put too much in, you ruin the soup. You don't put any in, you have tasteless broth.
But isn't it true that in that culture, when you were reading those lines, you'd also be thinking of the great mystical poets who compare the love affair of the soul with God to a human love affair, because there are times when God is harsh with you and you sulk and you whine and you pout, and then the return comes and it's so much deeper and richer because of the pain of separation. So that underlies the whole worldly aspect also, doesn't it, in these
Yes. Oh my goodness. And so all of these verses, and what I think makes them so rich is they can be read as our very earthly, adventures in love, adventures and misadventures in love. But also, what does that tell us about the adventures of our heart in our relationship?
And the ultimate adventure with divine love mirrors this. Yes. So beautiful.
And so this verse always strikes me because it has an image which in fact is flowing through the entire work, which is of how water and land connect. The way, you can think of a great river.
Second chapter in the whole book is on rain. First, this tremendous description of the nature of God, and then you can't imagine why until you get it, that rain is the source of life. It's the mother. So you have the transcendent and then the immanent placed immediately at the beginning of the book.
Yes.
And water runs through the Kural, just as the search for water, the need for water runs through the whole of Tamil Nadu and
Yes.
that world, because it's a dry, fierce world. Yeah.
Yes. And there is in this verse all of that. It is about this process of sulking. And here, I'll just read it here. Hearts joined like earth and water. What heaven transcends their sulking? We're so accustomed to think that the union is the great thing. And here he's saying what heaven transcends the sulking, because that means that we'll come back again to something even greater than what we knew.
But maybe also it means that the sulking itself, because it's so intense and it's so painful, is a sign of the depth of the love, which is heaven.
Yes, and which is like those tears that come to us, showing us how full our hearts truly are.
Right.
And there's something beautiful in this verse. And, one of the things that I've done to try to translate this work is I've also written my own brief, but I hope useful commentary to these verses. And this verse alludes to one of the great classical love poems about a lover and his or her beloved meeting. And so I've printed that poem in the commentary, and I thought I would share that here because I think it speaks to the depth of this understanding of love, embodied love, and the more than that all of that includes. So it's just a 5-line poem that goes like this. It's about two lovers who have no previous connection. They weren't born. Their love isn't the result of an arrangement by the parents. Their parents don't know each other. Maybe they come from different communities altogether. And they ask, who is your mother to mine? How is my father related to yours? How did we know one another? Like rainfall and red earth, our hearts themselves came together. And that for me is as much a statement of what we would call romantic love as a statement of the kind of experience I had, for instance, meeting my Tamar teacher and our own hearts coming together to learn from and with each other, or my experience with this beautiful village outside of the city of Madurai, where though we have no, our parents don't know each other, we're from different lands, different languages, and yet our hearts themselves come together. And the world is forever different for all of us.
Rumi says about his meeting with Shams and about love, he said, lovers were in each other always. So the meeting is a confirmation of a meeting that has happened in the eternal already. It's an unfolding from the timeless into time. So that's what that evokes for me. Read it again. It is so perfect. And it's so perfect when you love that particular country too, because it is red earth and rain, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. Here it is. And it's from a poet who was known simply by this poem, honored of rainfall and red earth was how he was called.
That's enough.
That is enough.
Yeah.
Who is your mother to mine? How is my father related to yours? How did we know one another? Like rainfall and red earth, our hearts themselves came together.
It goes to the heart of the mystery of karma, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that too is part of the great secret order that the Kural celebrates in all of its multifoliate manifestations. Thomas, what a great joy to have spent this hour with you in the middle of this extraordinary world, the real world, our world.
The real
I hope
world.
everybody who's been listening realizes this isn't about ancient Tamil Nadu. This is our true world when we see it with the eyes of wonder and the eyes of the heart. That's what makes him a permanent, timeless poet of our potential sacred world, which we have to give everything we are at this moment to find in ourselves and build in the real world before the madmen destroy it.
And he is a poet who can be for each of us an extraordinary friend,
Yeah.
both stern and intimate, and loving at the deepest levels.
My friends, get this book, The Kural, translated by Hitoshi Pruiksma. I'm going to spell his name because it is such an exotic name. Where does it come from?
It comes from the northern Netherlands, from Friesland. It's a Frisian name.
So you have Japanese and Dutch.
Yes.
What
Japanese and Dutch, even more specifically, I have Frisian and Okinawan. Those worlds mixing as well.
Of course, yes. It's Thomas Hitoshi, Hitoshi, and then Pruiksma. Please avail yourself of this book and let it soak in your heart and let it give to you what it's clearly given to Thomas and it's given to me. It will be a profound companion on your evolutionary journey. Thank you so, so much. God bless your amazing work and all the wonderful works that will flow from you. And thank you on behalf of everyone for all the work and all the passion and all the learning and all the longing and all the brilliance that you focused in making so selflessly available this truly, truly astounding and regenerative masterpiece. Bless you. I bow to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And as my friends in Tamil Nadu might say, in acknowledging something, a gratitude that goes beyond words. Nandri Varnakam.
Nandri Vanakam.